A Shattered Life and a Shattered Life Experiences. I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it lifted me, there was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands, arms and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus on the times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met March. She and I got along great, though, to be honest. I'm fairly sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched onto some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a co-worker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the police officers. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion. "How'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. The thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary: the date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing, the layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me of the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, but I would also never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell March. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly, I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser, but I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so, it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds, and I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. Grandpa? He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. Who are you? He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" Ah, of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He burned bright red. Trying to, anyway. All right. Run off, I'll read this right now. The words were blurry and annoying. I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now an adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. How was it? Well, it's terrible, I told him truthfully. But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid. I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story. He nodded. It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that, I told him. An idea occurred to me. If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures? Sure. I read everything I can. I love it. Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it well. You're serious? Yes. He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. I'll look into it, see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound. Wow. Sounds like a plan. I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. But how will I get all the notes in one place? Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them, he said, frowning with thought. Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life, see if there's a pattern. For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there. Sure. He turned and left the living room. I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap!" But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. Did I write those? He looked up at me with wonder. Yeah. Or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. So, you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird. That much I understood. Right. He gulped. There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time. His tone dropped to deadly seriousness. But I will save you, Grandpa. Because I don't think anyone else can. Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days, and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 30th, and my last box was the 1st. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. "Come on, I think I finally figured it out." I was so frail that moving was painful. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" "Yes." He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. "How long have you worked on this?" I asked him, aghast. "Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine." His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. "It'll be worth it." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look. This shock is carefully calibrated." The electric zap from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapidly arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear, and its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite. And it was feeding on my mind. My now-adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this?" Fearful, I asked, "Is Mar here?" His face softened. "No. Not for a few years now." I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. "How?" "We have this conversation a lot," he responded. "Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better." Tears brimmed in my eyes. "Then I don't care if it hurts, or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive." He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. "I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist on our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of Asset, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness/reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you." I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head in exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. "What's Asset?" He paused his work and grew pale. "I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me." After a deep breath, he began moving again, and placed his fingers near a few switches. "Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy." I could still see Mar's smile. Even though she was dead, I'd just been with her moments ago. "Do it." The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then, I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh. No. It did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6 clawed lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mar's smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mar's hand and be there for her. No. No. That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a quite different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as the nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God! I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before, but, this time, it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze. And while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew. Together, my grandfather and I set out to write the tale of his life. Unfortunately, his Alzheimer's disease progressed rapidly, and we were never able to finish. He's still alive, but I imagine that, mentally, he is in a better place than the nursing home. I like to think he's back in his younger days, living life and being happy, because the reality is much colder. It's snowing today, he loves the snow. When I visited him, he didn't recognize me, but he did smile as he sat looking out the window. I should not have read this at work. That was amazing, and I'm sitting in the lunchroom trying not to cry. And I'm a grown-ass man, lol. I wish I could hug my grandparents again, too bad heaven doesn't have visiting hours. I'm crying. In the earlier parts of the story, I could recognize the signs of Alzheimer's in your character, and I think the way you made the disease an actual being that can be fought off was amazing. My great-grandma had Alzheimer's and died when I was a kid. Unfortunately, I never knew her the way the rest of my family got to. Beautiful, tragic, and terrifying. Excellent job. The end made me tear up at work. The first time the narrator was an old man saying "Who are you?" to a family member, I immediately thought of Alzheimer's, but I had no clue it was going to be so personal and meaningful. I've never had to see a loved one suffer from Alzheimer's, thank God, but this still resonated with me. My grandma suffered a stroke a month ago, and she now has permanent brain damage. One of the most painful things I've ever experienced was seeing her in the hospital, awake but barely responsive and completely incoherent, trying to say goodbye and tell her I loved her and having her not even understand me. I can't even imagine what my dad felt like when he said, "Hey, it's me," and she replied, "Nice to meet you." Nobody deserves to be in a condition like that. My point is, thank you for this story. It was really beautiful and meaningful. You and your grandfather aren't alone. I do believe you're right, and our grandparents are both in a better place mentally. This is an absolutely stunning story. Your writing is magnificent, and the connection to Alzheimer's makes it a true horror story. This made me cry, not out of sadness, but of the beauty of life and memories that you portrayed. Thank you so much for writing this. It's like The Time Traveler's Wife, but made much more powerfully because of that author's note. What a wonderful grandson you are, Matt. I'm going to go hug my grandparents. No matter how good or bad they might be thankful you still have them. What I wouldn't give to hug my grandfather once again and say a true goodbye. It's been almost a decade and my heart still ache, and I still cry. I dread that threshold where I'll have lived more of my life without him than with him. I lost my grandmother on Christmas 2016. It was pretty rough because I was really close with her, but I understood. And I knew she wouldn't want me to feel sad forever. But last month we had to put my dog down. That was the hardest experience of my life. It feels bad to say I was more distraught about losing my dog than my own grandmother, but she was such a special dog. So much personality. She always made us laugh and smile no matter what. And she was always full of life, even at the very end. I know people always think their dog is the most special, but this one truly is. I've had other dogs and we still have one, but they're just dogs, I still love them and all. But none will compare to Daisy. I completely understand, my friend. Know that I'm here, a fellow dog lover who cherishes every sloppy kiss, every walkie even when I'm dead tired, every bit of fur on my coat, pants, shirts that I pick off of would F my clothes. I cherish seeing him sitting at the front door doing his wiggle butt dance when he sees that it's me, home from work. Every hour bathing him, brushing him, going goodbye to the woods, and spending the next 2 hours brushing burrs and checking for ticks. I'm so sorry for your loss, R.I.P. Daisy Blossom. And would you say hi to Lucky 4-leaf clover from us? We miss him so. I'm sorry for the pain you feel. I lost my paternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather in a span of 6 months. Both came as a shock and none of us had any chance to say a proper goodbye. My father couldn't say goodbye to either of his parents, and I know it still hurts him. We have a dog, Simba. I know that one day he won't be around, and just thinking about it makes me well up. I'm sure Daisy must have been an obedient dog and an even better companion. I hope you find peace soon, and remember, they're all looking at you from above. I'm 19 and exhibiting symptoms of what my doctor calls memory issues. They've only gotten worse, starting when I was 15. I'm afraid I'll get dementia really young. I'm afraid this story will be me soon. My girlfriend doesn't get why I am so scared when she has to constantly remind me of things, important things, she told me the day before, or I forget how many pills I've taken, or even trivial things. This is why I'm so terrified. This is what my nightmares are. No one around me seems to grasp why I have so much fear. My grandmother is 96 with vascular dementia. She lives at home, bedridden, and is cared for by my 95-year-old grandfather in the house they bought right after the war. This was so accurate it gives me chills just thinking about it. She skips through time like a stone across a pond, touching down into reality every so often and then being ripped, hurtling through time and space. She predicted the birth of my son with jaw-dropping accuracy. I'd been pregnant for 24 hours and no one had any idea, me included. I like to think the dementia has made her a bit of a witch, and although we live 5,000 miles apart, she can harness the chaos and cruise around, seeing all of the wonderful things that are happening outside of her tiny home. Not an end I would wish on my worst enemy, but your story was spine-tingling. I just finished writing my grandfather's memoirs with him. We published it a couple of days ago. It took 8 years to finish. The whole time, I kept growing fearful his mind would fail before we got it finished. It's terrible to hear you suffered the thing I feared so much. I wish I could say something comforting. Thank you for writing this. So as soon as I read Asset, I knew I recognized it from another story I read a few months ago. Turns out, it was also mentioned in this story. Neither story gives very much detail as to what Asset is, but the earlier story points towards Asset being God. This story, however, points to Asset being more of a malicious god, as the grandson stated that the demon mind lizard was a spawn of Asset. Also, the way in which the grandson tells his grandfather that he is better off not knowing what Asset is makes me believe that perhaps that knowledge is a burden rather than a gift. I believe that the protagonists from the previous story set off a chain of events that introduced Asset into our dimension, or at least our consciousness. I believe that this introduction was a catalyst for Asset gaining enough powerful to be able to interfere with our dimension. This was incredibly beautiful. It's such a wonderful sentiment, and the life and effort put forth into this story shines through. Alzheimer's is hell. It's one of my biggest fears. My dad was in initial stages of it when he died. Sometimes the look in his eyes said more than he ever could about his he was feeling. Such a beautiful story. I can't explain into words how this made me feel. My heart goes out to the ones suffering from it and the ones around them. Tears are involuntarily falling. This story is over 4 years old. But this is the best story I've read on Reddit and one of the best short stories I've ever read. It's so captivating and emotional. I love the way that the main character feels about March. I love how he expresses it to the reader. Awesome job. I just got my first award ever and I gave it to you 4 years after posting. This is a beautiful story of love, loss, and the pain of life. You and your grandfather have one another and always the falling snow. Reading just the first few paragraphs, I immediately thought of my mother's Alzheimer's. Fantastic read and moving story. I wish the best for you and your family. I thought it would turn out to be the reason for dementia and Alzheimer's, but I did not expect that. You are a good person for sitting and dictating his life story. A lot of people avoid any interaction because of how painful it is when they disconnect and can't recall who you are. Going through this with my grandmother as well doesn't affect me. When it's me, she forgets as much as when I see her not recognize my dad. Okay, now I'm super sad. That author's note made me tear up. Both my grandparents on my father's side suffered from Alzheimer's, and I am currently caring for my grandmother on my mother's side who suffers from dementia. She doesn't always recognize me, or realize that I'm her kin, but seeing her happy is all that matters to me. Thank you for this story. I'm sorry to hear about your grandfather, man. I think that thinking he is in a better place than the nursing home is an effective way to look at it. Before my grandfather became confined to a bed and lost his ability to speak due to Alzheimer's, he used to tell me stories when I visited of the day he just spent golfing in Ottawa, or how he just made a huge sale with the company he started. It really gave me hope that he didn't have to fully experience what was happening to him and what we watched him go through. Like he could live in a different world from us in peace. Also, this story was amazing. Thank you for taking the time to post it here. This was such an amazing story. My grandfather passed away from Alzheimer's and we're seeing early signs of it in my mother now too. This brought such a creative and unique light to a terrifying and misunderstood disease. I remember the day I had to introduce myself to my grandpa, and he looked at me like I was a stranger. It's a painful thing. I'm so sorry you are having to experience that now. That was an awesome story. My mom had dementia. It eventually took her life. I remember the first time I visited her in the assisted living facility when she did not recognize me. I am her only daughter of 5 children. She was happy to have a visitor. The first thing she said to me was, "So, how's your mother?" Ha ha. I can laugh about it now, but when I left her that day, I was so upset I sat in my car and cried for a while before driving home. Thank you for this story. I appreciate your perspective. I've had a few experiences where it's felt like something outside of my being merged and melded itself to my psyche, yet a part of my soul that I had not sensed before. This was during, and a few months after my first times trying psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms. This was followed by confusion, agony, and angst. But I never had such a drastic shift in reality after the fact. Long-lasting paranoia, mindless illusions, spiritual battles, which are fruitless and which I never intended to experience. I've always seen slight energy ever since I was a child, but it's gotten to the point where it distracts me on a daily basis, whether I'm in class or trying to sleep. As I've typed this, I've actually felt like some kind of parasite has attached to my back. Maybe it's psychedelic persisting hallucinatory disorder or whatever, but it's difficult to ignore. Man, this story is heart-wrenching and beautiful. Really utterly amazing work. I'm literally crying. I actually cried. You've done it again. You never fail to amaze me. Thank you. I am crying at work now, thanks so much. Seriously though. Beautiful story. Wow, what a beautifully tragic story. I loved it. Beautifully written. Thank you for this. Heartsuit.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.